Um, Welcome to the February 2025 meeting of Science, Scripture, and Reason. And we're really delighted to have Mark Perez with us this evening. I'll just give you a brief background on Mark. He is a retired Los Angeles Police Department Deputy Chief of Police with a 36-year career in law enforcement where he taught critical thinking and problem solving. He served Reasons to Believe as part of the scholar community and is currently the Chief Operating Officer. He continues to research in decision-making, cognitive biases, and other aspects of critical thinking. Mark is a contributing author to the Reasons to Believe book, Thinking About Evolution, and co-authored the recently released book, Clear Thinking in a Messy World, A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Biases with Ken Samples. And here is the book, which I highly recommend. Mark earned a BA in philosophy and an MA in analytic philosophy of science from California State University, Los Angeles, and a California State University certificate in teaching critical thinking. He also holds a Master's of Public Administration from American Military University with an emphasis on organizational development. Mark is going to help us to understand cognitive biases and how we can recognize them and how we can hopefully avoid them or mitigate their effects. So Mark, thank you so much for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Randy. We'll go to look at the context of this. How is it that we even come to talk about this tonight? Randy, you showed the book to you, and I want to give you a little bit of history about how that book even came to be, because it's a bit of an interesting story. Originally, Ken Samples had wanted to do a book on critical thinking, and he had talked to me because he and I had worked together when I was a volunteer. And he knew my background in critical thinking teaching and logic and the fallacies, et cetera. And he said, well, why don't we team up on a critical thinking book? And I said, oh, that's interesting, but, there are a ton of critical thinking books out there. Well, why should we do that? And he said, well, we could look at it from a Christian perspective. And I said, well, that's good, but what else would it do? And he said, well, I'm thinking about including a section on the life of the mind. And I said, oh, well, okay, that's a little bit more interesting, because that is actually a Christian background. But I told him the thing that I would like to do if I were going to contribute to that is, I can leave the logic and the fallacies to you, or we can both work on it together. But the one thing I would really want to do, if you wanted to get a book together, is to work on cognitive biases, put some chapters in there on cognitive biases. And the reason for that was that cognitive biases are sort of the missing link in critical thinking. You don't see very many critical thinking texts that talk about cognitive biases. A few do, but they don't go in a lot of depth. And so when he thought about that, then we worked together on what it might look like. We joined forces, and the book that you have now, that Clear Thinking in a Messy World, contains chapters on cognitive biases and a little bit more. So from my perspective, the most important thing to figure out in cognitive biases is that they're real world. My whole interest in cognitive biases comes from many, many years of experience of things that require a lot of decisions. And decision-making is where cognitive biases show up the most often. That's where you're going to have the cognitive biases intrude and distort your thinking. And I've taught this to managers and to others because the real world is where this matters. There's tons and tons of academic research on cognitive biases. I will show you a document here. This is a list of cognitive biases. It goes, I don't know how many pages, but it got about 167 of them. You can draw that list down from Wikipedia. It may even have more now. I took this list off of it some time back. So to understand every single cognitive bias is quite a feat. Some of them overlap. But the most important thing is, what are they? That was the point of the lecture today. And what do we do with them? So the way I'm going to go about this is explain, first of all, where we see cognitive biases showing up, and the kind of the steps or the procedure in which cognitive biases arise. So first of all, let's appreciate that there are objective, rational standards for decision making, and they work really well when the procedures are properly followed. And these rational standards are things like deductive logic or inductive logic and math. There are systems where if you operate within their procedures, they'll give you the results that you want to get, given what that particular procedure is supposed to do. We also have what I would call a detection catalog for certain kinds of misleading or irrelevant information, and we call that list informal fallacies. Sometimes informal fallacies and cognitive biases overlap. In other words, some informal fallacies are cognitive biases or are driven by cognitive biases. And in the book, I go over a few in particular, because one of the reasons that we should know that is that not only knowing informal fallacies helps you to detect irrelevant things and misleading things in arguments, but some of them have power because of cognitive biases. So ideally, our minds would always use rational decision standards, ideally. But what do you think? We would spot and avoid misleading informal fallacies. Sure, we would do that. And our judgments and our decisions would then be very rational, because we would be relying on standards that will necessarily produce the results that we expect them to produce. But applying formal and informal logic rigorously is really complicated sometimes. And if you look through the book, you'll see some sections on logic and some sections on informal fallacies. And you can see that some of that does get complicated. So if you were to apply logic and you go through a deductive process, for example, and every decision you wanted to make, it would wear you out. It would be just untenable. It requires a lot of focus and time and energy to use those rational standards, even though they may be included in what you're doing, but they do take time and they take energy. There are times when we just want to decide quickly and use mental shortcuts. And the reason is because our minds are lazy. And we can talk a little bit more about that later on, but the lazy mind is a feature that I describe in the book. It was also talked about by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which, by the way, I would recommend everybody who's watching this or being part of this read. It is the consummate book on cognitive biases. It started the tradition. So we have these lazy minds, and we tend to look for what's most obviously relevant and what comes most easily to mind. And those two things are really important for us to catch. So what's most obviously relevant is what first comes to our view or first comes to our consideration. And what comes easily to mind is what we will usually stick on. And that creates some problems. When we do this, we're not conscious that we're using mental shortcuts. So instead of using the long procedures in logic or math or inductive logic or in any of those kinds of disciplines, then when you're not doing that, you don't know it. You're just going through your thought process. And when you're not conscious of using these mental shortcuts, some interesting things happen. Now, part of it is that the mental shortcuts sometimes work. Matter of fact, they often work. And we almost always use them. And because we almost always use them, they become habitual. It just becomes part of the way we think, and they're completely invisible to us. So these mental shortcuts are what we're using instead of, or in addition to a little bit of, those rational standards. But mental shortcuts don't always work, even when they feel like they do. And that's a key point, is that very often we're relying on our feelings to guide whether our decisions are accurate or inaccurate, or whether our thinking is rational or not rational, or even effective. Feelings guide that. And remember that and keep that in the back of your mind, that feelings will guide our mental shortcuts. And our tendency to use shortcuts when the shortcuts only seem to work, but in fact are missing important steps in reasoning, that is cognitive bias. So let's step back. We have these rational standards. They take a lot of energy. They take a lot of time. We use shortcuts because they don't, because they often work. They also are invisible to us. So we just use them without even any thought at all. But sometimes when they seem to work, they're not really working. And it's a cognitive bias when you're using a shortcut and you miss some important steps in the rational decision-making process. Cognitive biases lead to generally predictable errors in decisions or judgments. Generally predictable, and we'll talk more about that in a second. They're predictable because certain kinds of decisions entail rational considerations that shortcuts easily miss. So what kind of things are we talking about? So we know that the shortcuts can be a problem. They often work, though. Our minds are lazy, which is why we use mental shortcuts. And in some respects, it's good to have a lazy mind, because if you tried to use everything, if you tried to do everything and process it through rigorous logic and deductive logic and math, etc., you would have a very difficult time making very simple decisions, like, are you going to stay home or are you going to go to work, or those kinds of things. So what do these cognitive biases look like? And I showed you the paper that had about 167 of them on there. I'm just going to go through a few of them. And as I go through them, the thing I would like you to think about is, have you ever seen them? And have you ever suffered them? And I picked the ones, not all of the ones that are in the book. I don't remember how many we put in there, but they're more in the book than I'm going to be talking about here, because I really want to get into Q&A. But one of the first that's interesting to me is the gambler's fallacy. And the gambler's fallacy is the tendency to believe that the probability of a random event is influenced by past outcomes. For example, if I flip a coin, what's the chances that the coin's going to show up heads? 50-50. Okay, we're talking about an honest coin. We're not talking about a weighted coin. So what if I flip it again? What are the chances that it's going to be heads? 50-50. So what happens is, if you were to do this before a group of people and flip that coin 5 times and it were to show up heads 5 times, people would have a tendency to believe that the next one would be tails, or that tails is going to come up very soon. Now, that tendency to believe that is a shortcut in thinking, because what they're not doing is they're not realizing that each one of those coin flips is independent. And they're thinking as if these irrelevant past events, each of which is independent, has some influence on the future, when it really does not. And that's very interesting, particularly for people who are doing things that look at patterns where there's some sequence in the back, and that there are independent events that lead to that. So the gambler's fallacy is that tendency to believe that the probability of a random event is influenced by past outcomes. And in the book, we talked a little bit about the gambler's fallacy and the multiverse. And I qualified that because there are many multiverse theories, and only one of them befalls the gambler's fallacy. And that is that if you have enough, in order to have the particular universe we have now, there must have been a whole bunch of them that came beforehand, and we just happened to land on this one. Not recognizing that just because we have the universe we have now doesn't mean you had to have some number of universes before that, and that we just got lucky. So there is that one argument against that one version of the multiverse, and I get into that more in the book. So the gambler's fallacy is an example of a tendency to believe something or to shortcut something because you feel that the next thing is going to happen is a result of what happened before, when each of the incidents before was entirely independent. So the next one, let's look at something else. The next one is sometimes called an availability heuristic. I call it the availability shortcut. And the availability shortcut is overestimating the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. Now, I'll give you an example of this in just a second, but let's go through that definition one more time. Overestimating the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. So the first thing that pops into my mind is crimes and media attention. So if you think about the way media present a particular crime, so like on the news at 6 o'clock, you look at your Channel 7 I Missed It news, and you see some close-up of a body on the ground and the police all around there, and they talk about, this particular crime. Then you see another one tomorrow, maybe another one a few days later. And these kinds of things come readily to mind because there is nothing else that's coming to mind when it comes to crime. And it's what happens when that kind of a pattern occurs is that people overestimate the likelihood that crime is occurring when in fact it isn't. So the missing step is not testing the belief against data that do not readily come to mind. So merely because you see these events doesn't mean that there's a whole bunch of them. It just means that these readily come to mind. And that's where the media make their money. That's the way advertising makes their money, is to make you believe that these individual events represent something much bigger. And because they bring them to your mind, in other words, like you see advertising of a particular kind over and over and over again, or this particular kind of crime stats or crime events, any kind of thing that's going to let you think that this is prevalent, think about the availability shortcut. And that is that people have a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of these events just because the events come easily to mind. The next one is something that we call survivorship bias. This one's very interesting because it's the tendency to focus on successes while neglecting failures. And one of the most common examples of this is what happened in World War II when the Air Force was trying to figure out how they were going to keep their bombers from getting shot down. And they were looking at the bombers when they came back from their bombing runs, and they'd always lose some. And then there would be some that would come back, and they would look at the gunshots or the damage that was done to the survivors and try and figure out, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that they don't get shot down? And then comes along a mathematician. And the mathematician says, well, this is very interesting, but are you really looking at the right thing? Because if you really think about it, what you're paying attention to is strictly that part of the data that survived. What about the ones that didn't survive? If you look at all of the places where the gunshots and the other damage is done, it didn't bring the airplanes down. So what are we doing? We need to be looking at what did come down. So are there areas on this aircraft that aren't shot up that we maybe should cover up? Because obviously these particular places aren't places that are fatal to the aircraft. And so what he did, his name was Wald, Abraham Wald, mathematician, said that if you're going to look at a set of things that you're wondering why something survives, is you have to look at why things didn't. And in that case, they were not really comparing not asking why the ones that got down did not survive. And this is very interesting too in another respect, in that if you look at, for example, leadership books or biographies where you have successful business people or businesses themselves, and they represent how to do it right. And the question should be asked, if they're going to give a formula for how they did what they did, and how that business came to be, How many other businesses did the same thing and didn't survive? Or why didn't they survive? So the survivorship bias is the tendency to look at only what survives, the high performers or the people who are successful, and not the ones who didn't, because those are going to inform you even more in some cases of what it takes to avoid failure, as well as what it takes to achieve success. The next one is something that's called, among other things, a small numbers bias. And the small numbers bias is a tendency to rely on too small a sample to represent the whole. And the missing step here in the reasoning is the step of determining the proper sample size. This occurs a lot. And if you just think about, for example, let's say health authorities that are looking at a cluster of disease in a particular area, and they extrapolate that and say, well, if it's occurring here, it's going to be occurring everywhere. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And so when you're looking at this small number and then you're saying, well, this represents the whole, then you're missing the point of asking whether the sample size is proper. Now, statistics will help you with that. It's one of the rational standards because it's a mathematical procedure. But most people will miss that. They won't use a statistical analysis. They'll go directly to what they think is that this appears to look like it should represent the whole, and then just run with it rather than asking what the final result should be. In other words, what is the real sample size that would be viable? The next one is one that everyone in this particular group should be particularly concerned with. And it's called the confirmation bias. And most of us have heard of that. But the reason that I think it's so important to particularly apologetics is that it can really contaminate your ability to interact with other people who have different ideas. So what is a confirmation bias? Well, it's a tendency to seek only information that supports one's theory or belief. So if you're, for example, a researcher and you're only looking for publications that support your opinion or theory, you're suffering a confirmation bias. That's a very widespread problem. And there are actually a lot of procedures built in to certain kinds of disciplines like medical research and other things to account for confirmation bias. But it doesn't always happen when you're doing your own research. Because if you're walking into something and you have a position, you have a theory, even if you're open-minded, your tendency will be to look for information that supports your theory. That just is the confirmation bias. So we have to be really, really careful of this because it doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter that you even know this, that a confirmation bias is there. If you're not checking for it, you're very likely doing it. It's so common, it's very, very common, that it's one of the ones that I think is the most dangerous, and we really need to be on the lookout for it. I remember seeing it used or looking at it and thinking that when I was overseeing detectives, for example, and they would go to a crime scene and they would walk into a crime scene and what are they going to see? They're going to see whatever they see, but they're going to be looking for patterns. And once they see a pattern that's familiar to them, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to set up a theory. And when they set up that theory, what are they going to be looking for? Well, if they're not careful, and this is a really, really tough thing for detectives, they have to learn this the hard way sometimes. If they're not careful, they'll be looking for the kind of evidence that will confirm their theory. And I watched that happen in one very important case. It was a cold case homicide, where the first detectives that showed up at the scene came upon a house where the house had been ransacked and it looked like they'd been burglarized and the person who was in the house had been killed. And so it looked like when you walk in, you see all of the drawers turned over and all sorts of stuff all over the place, that it was a home invasion, and they just happened to find the homeowner there and then killed him to prevent him from talking. So that was the working theory as they went in, and it was perfectly rational theory. The only problem is it didn't account for all the evidence that was there. And so when the case went cold, they didn't find anybody who did this. And it was just a whodunit. 10 years later, when I was overlooking the detective unit that was doing cold case homicides, one of the homicide detectives said, "Hey, we're going out on this thing here, and it's very interesting." And he was looking at what we call the murder book. The murder book is all of the pictures and documentation that has to do with a particular homicide. And he said, "There's just something wrong with this, and I can't figure out what it is." So to make a long story short, he goes back to the scene years later, and he starts looking around. He says, "I'd like to look at something." And so he asked the new homeowner, can I look inside there? Because the victim had been shot sitting in a chair facing a fireplace. And he said, "Sure, please." And so the detective he grabs a flashlight, and he looks up the chimney. And when he looks up the chimney, he sees a pistol suspended on what looks like a bungee cord or something that would stretch. She completely changed the theory. And so what eventually happened was they determined that it wasn't a murder at all. It was a suicide, and that the victim had sat himself in the chair after making it look like the place had been ransacked and that he would be a murder victim, shot himself, let go of the gun, and it went up into the chimney. So it's suicide to make it look like a homicide. And the homicide detectives didn't even figure that out when they went in the first time around, because they missed a couple of important features that wouldn't be interesting if you were looking at purely the evidence for a homicide, like they were thinking about. So the bottom line to that was the confirmation bias actually prevented the original detectives from looking at certain kinds of features around the fireplace that would have tipped them off that there was more to it than they thought. Confirmation bias works like that. You just come up with a theory, and then you look for things to confirm it. And we as apologists have to be really careful about that, because what happens when we start looking at things, when we get somebody who says, "Well, I don't see it the way you see it. Here's what I believe." If you're going to start researching that, what will you be researching? Well, you'll be researching things to support your own position. Now, if you're a good researcher and you're a good apologist, you're going to say, "All right, I will look for things that confirm my position, but I'm also going to look for things that don't." So, is there anything good for that? Well, not really, because there's another cognitive bias called disconfirmation bias. We talk about that also in the book. A disconfirmation bias is a tendency to critique the evidence disconfirming your theory more vigorously than confirming evidence. So let's say the researcher discounts evidence against their theory without using the same analyses of evidence for their own theory. In other words, you look at the evidence that you find against your own theory, and you give it much more analysis and rigor in analysis than you paid to yours. So what do you do with that? Well, you have to make sure that knowing what confirmation bias is and knowing what disconfirmation bias is, you're careful to account for both of them when you're doing research. No matter what the research is, both of those can happen. So, on one hand, the confirmation bias is kind of a selfish bias, and it's an interest to find that you're right. But the disconfirmation bias is the kind of accident, short step, mental step that you miss when you're actually trying to be virtuous, where you are looking for the other evidence, but unconsciously, you're not giving as much attention to your own evidence as you're giving to your opponents. So those are confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias are two different biases, but they're obviously related. And they're really crucial for us in apologetics and for us as researchers. The next one is called the anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is interesting because it is a tendency to rely on the first information that gets received when making a decision. Often when that first information is irrelevant, and that skews the decision toward the first anchor. And the missing step here is that the challenging the relevance of the anchor just isn't done. And I'll give you some examples. When I was still working with the police department, I spent a few years as their chief labor negotiator. And part of my job was to negotiate the collective bargaining agreements with 21 different bargaining units, which means I was across the table with the unions representing a large number of employees. So what would we do when we got to the table? Well, the first thing the union would do is lay down a demand. That's the technical term for what we want. That was just absolutely crazy. Okay, we want a 25% pay increase, and we want 20 more days of vacation pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which was just preposterous. But what were they doing? What they were trying to do was to start at the very top of something and then work from that. In other words, they wanted the negotiations to start with their anchor and then work from there so that their anchor would move the entire negotiation scale up rather than where it should be. And that's a very effective tactic. Now, it didn't work with me or any of the people I was working with because we already knew it. But the point is that when you see that kind of thing where there's an initial offer, recognize that that's very often an anchor. So in negotiations, for example, you're negotiating a house deal and the house price is really, really high. Why do they have it that high? Well, because they want to start high and see if you're going to go up there. And if you anchor in that tall price, then you're not paying attention to what you really believe the house is worth to start with. So anchoring is very successful in negotiations. And if you pay attention to it, the way to get past it is when you see an anchor, the first thing that's presented, ask yourself, what would be my position if I never saw that number? Recognizing that that number is actually going to unconsciously cause you to deviate up rather than right where it should be. That occurs in pricing. For example, if you go to a store and you see a sticker and it has a line through it and says, was $10.99, now $9.99. Well, that slashed price is actually an anchor. It's in your mind and the mind of anybody who's been looking at that particular price. You just anchored them on a higher number. And so when they see this lower number, they're looking at the lower number as if it's a viable number. And it looks better than it would if there were no anchor. The same thing with decoy prices. For example, you go in and there's a $2,000 suit on the rack, and there's another rack that has $1,000 suits that looks like a better deal. And you're anchored in this $2,000 price range. And usually the salesman will start you there. And then you say, well, it's kind of pricey for me. Then it goes down to 1,000, where the truth is that neither one of them is worth the price that they're giving you, but they're actually worth more like $500 or $600 or something like that. So instead of you looking at the suits and saying, okay, what do I really pay for this if I didn't know what they're trying to offer or demand? And if you're not doing that, it's very easy to be seduced upwards. And that's a very common ploy in sales and marketing. And it makes things look like a better deal than they really are. And people fall for it all the time. All the time. That's why it gets used all the time, because it is effective. Anchoring bias is one of the most powerful biases. And even when people know about it, they will often fall for it. So the way you would get past that is to just ignore the numbers and just focus strictly on what would the value of this be if I didn't know any other numbers? What price would I offer? Completely behind a veil of ignorance of what they want me to pay. Now, there's an interesting study that was done, and it's a very famous one, in which the researchers got a group of people together and separated random groups into two random groups. The first random group was asked a set of questions. So here's the setup. The question is, what proportion of the Indian continent, of the African nations are in the UN? Now, before that question gets asked, the first question is asked is the number of countries in the United Nations in Africa greater or less than 10%? So it's set up with that number. The first question is the percentage of nations in Africa that are members of the United Nations above or below 10%? That's question number one. Question number two is, what is the proportion of countries in the UN that are in Africa? That's group one. Set them aside, move to group two. Group two is asked the first question, but with a different number. So the first question is the percentage of countries in Africa that are member of the UN greater or lesser than 40%? And they come up with an answer. And then the second question is the same. What percentage of countries in Africa are members of the UN? So you have one group that's been anchored in a 10%, and the other group that's anchored in the 40%. Then the second question is identical for both of them. Different groups not seeing what the other saw. What do you think happened when they gave their estimates, when they were all averaged? Well, if you're thinking like I think you're thinking, well, the ones where they were first asked whether it was 40%, is going to have a higher average than the 10%, and you would be right. So I kind of led you into that, but that's exactly what anchoring bias does. Without any reason whatsoever, except for that initial anchor of 10% or 40%, that question alone was enough to alter the final numbers that people gave without any never being given to them. So what do we learn from that? What we learn is that the first information that's presented to you doesn't just have to be a price. It can be any number whatsoever that can anchor you into a position that you would be greater or lesser than. And you tend to drift towards that particular number rather than giving an analysis independent of that number. So the same lesson again is that the way to avoid the anchoring in those kinds of situations is to ignore the number altogether and just ask basically that second question. Without knowing that first number, what would my estimate be? So it's hard to do that because once you've been presented with the anchor, it's there. But you can do it if you just think about this particular experiment. Now, I'm going to give you another one that's more about the order of information. This is another famous experiment, and this one's fun because I actually got to try this one too. So imagine a group, a random group, just whatever population you want to get, and you divide it into half. Half the group comes into your room, and you say, all right, what I would like you to do is to look at a set of numbers. This is going to be a multiplication problem. And as quickly as you can, come to an estimate of what you think the product would be. So it's just, we're going to give you 10 seconds, for example. In 10 seconds, give us an estimate of what you think the product would be on this particular multiplication problem. So the first group gets this problem. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8. So they get that. They're given a certain number of seconds to estimate. You're told, obviously, don't get your calculator or do anything else. Don't try and work it out. Just estimate, just looking at that. What kind of estimate do you come up with? Okay, that group, we get their numbers, we average them, and that's value number 1. Now we bring in group number 2. Group number 2, same thing. You got X number of seconds, let's say 10 seconds, 15 seconds, to look at this product, this multiplication problem, and tell us an estimate of what you think the value would be. So the next group starts out with 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. It's just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 turned around. So you get those, you average them. And then you look at both of the groups. Is there a difference? The product is the same both ways. It doesn't matter how you do it. The commutative property allows you to move those multiplication numbers around any way you want. So, and everybody knows that. So everybody learned that in elementary school. But is that what happened? Did they both come up with roughly the same average? The answer is no. The answer is that the group that started out with the 1 times 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 came out with a lower average, substantially so, than the group that was started out with the 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Substantially different averages. Why? When they were both given the same problem? Well, they're anchored. And so what I found when I saw that reading that study, I said, every month I get a new cohort of people in the school that I was teaching. And so I tried it in the school. And so usually I'd have between 20 and 30 students in each session, each cohort. And I would work this out with them. And when the numbers were too small, that is, the number of students was too small, wild variations would skew the results. But it was almost exactly the same thing. It was consistently, when you had it closer to 30 students, it was consistently biased towards that. The high starting number was a higher value in the end. Lower starting number was a lower value in the end. They anchored off of that order of the information was powerful. Why? That's because that's the way people are, and that's why we have to be careful of that. And in this case here, we forced people to do something they probably wouldn't ordinarily do, but it's kind of a hint as to what we should be doing, which is slowing down. So let's look at another one. Let's look at something called the framing effect. We also talk about that in the book. And it's a tendency to react to how information is presented rather than just the information itself. And the missing step here is evaluating the number or statement objectively and considering other options. This is a big deal here because emotions overcome rationality. And in framing, the emotions play a big role in what you're going to do. And like, what am I talking about in terms of framing? Patients are more likely to accept surgery when the doctor says 90% of the patients survive the surgery, instead of saying 10% of them die from it. Now, if you were to just think about that, and you were talking to a doctor, and the doctor were to give you both of those, or one of them, for example, say, 90% of the people who go through the surgery survive. Would you rather hear that, or would you rather hear 10% of the people who go through the surgery are dead? That's framing. It's the same thing. Both of them are telling you exactly the same thing, same information, but framed totally differently. And the research very clearly shows that that does have a profound effect. And if you look in, for example, how things are sold, a classic example of that is when you go to the store and you look at a pound of ground beef. Is that 80% lean, or does it say it's 20% fat? It usually says it's 80% lean. How many people would want to buy it if the first thing it said on it, or the only thing it said is, all right, this pound of beef is 20% fat? Well, the research shows that most people would not want to buy that. They want to buy 80% lean. Not always. I guess if you're on a ketogenic diet, you want a higher number. But the bottom line is that the way that actually works out in real life is that people will bias towards that number that they find most interesting. And then the last part of that, or another part of it in framing, is the relative versus absolute change. So let me give you an example from my own life and my occupation, because there's so many interesting things that I can pull from there, and it really helped me understand a lot of these biases. So one of the things that I did was, when I was working with the police department, was I made some very significant changes to the discipline system. And I had to go into a public hearing to explain why I did that. And then I had to give a report that was based on a study that was done on the results. So when I went before the police commission in this public hearing, the results, I could have framed those results in two different ways. One way, and mind you, there's a lot of people in this room, there's news cameras, reporters, everything. What I say can have a lot of influence. And so I can use either of the two things that I'm going to tell you. One of them is that there was a 10% improvement in like-kind recidivism and misconduct. Or I could have said the system that I developed was 6 times better than the system that came before it. Which of those would you use? Now, both of these, by the way, accurately reflect the statistics that came out of that. One is, I could say 6 times better, or I could have said it was 10% reduction. Do you see how both of those, truthfully stated, can frame what the system is going to look like? Now, how could I say both of those are true? And where does that come from? So I'll step back and give you the real numbers so you can see the difference between absolute and relative numbers. So the actual numbers were 12% to start with, and were 2% after the changes that I made. So it truly is 10% reduction. And 2% is 1/6 of 12. So it's 6 times better. So how do you frame that? Well, how you frame it will determine how it gets reported in the news media or gets talked about, etc. So I had a very good motivation to actually say it was 6 times better, but I did not do that. My point is, how I did that, it really isn't as important as the fact that that's a very clear example of the actual numbers, a relative evaluation, which is 6 times better, or the actual number, the absolute number, which was 10% reduction. So framing is, it comes in very, very handy if you want it to, but you also have to look for it. And you have to ask yourself the question, is this an absolute or relative change? And how are the numbers being represented here? Another place where this occurs is in drug effectiveness reports. And this you really have to be careful of, because you'll see drugs marketed and they'll say, there's a 50% increase in or 50% decrease in symptoms when this particular drug is used. All right, so it's a 50% decrease, but if the decrease is 2% down to 1%, what do you really have? You have a 1% difference. But if I sell this stuff and I say, hey, there's a 50% drop in symptoms because of using this particular drug, does that sound like it's something that people are going to buy or doctors are going to want to use? If you don't pay attention to the relative numbers and the absolute numbers, you will be easily duped. And you should look for that when you hear those kinds of numbers being used. The last thing is just when you look at really controversial topics, for example, climate change, and you hear things like there's a 30% drop in the temperature or 20% rise in the ocean levels or something like that. Oh, then you should be asking yourself, okay, well, exactly how much did that go? Not what percentage. Don't give me the relative numbers. Give me the absolute numbers. Is it a 2-foot rise, 1-foot rise, and where does it rise, and how does it rise, and so forth. So the framing effect is very, very effective, and it's a cognitive bias that we will suffer easily, and the people we work around will suffer easily if we don't pay very close attention to it. And part of that is because we are lazy-minded and we just don't think it through. And mental shortcuts occur because we tend to go really quickly. And one of the best examples is, the famous story of the bat and the ball. So some of you have heard this problem before, but some of you haven't. And it's fun, if you haven't, to actually see this one. So here's the problem. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? You ask a group of people that, and you'll get whatever result you get. Now, people who've actually heard this before, easily they know what the solution is. But the first answer you'll get, the most prevalent, and I also tested this on many, many groups, is about 90% of the population will say 5 cents. And they'll say, well, 5 cents is, 5 cents more than the bat's $1. It's, that's it. That's the number, 5 cents. But it isn't. It's actually 10 cents. So that number is reversed. So the bat costs $1.05 and the ball costs 5 cents. And so people are coming up with the wrong number because they're coming at it too fast and they're missing the point. And that mental shortcut example is an example of not testing the number that you come up with. So if you come up with the wrong one to begin with, which most people do, then you've not tested the number. So that's one of the kinds of tricks that is fun to watch, and it's not really a trick, it's really very clear. So let me summarize this because it looks like we're getting short on time here. We have rational standards like math and logic, but we don't, using them all the time is just too time consuming and inconvenient. And so we unconsciously use mental shortcuts instead because they quite often work. But in many cases, the mental shortcuts merely seem to work, but actually miss important steps in reasoning. And the tendency to rely on mental shortcuts when they're likely to produce error is cognitive bias. So how do we overcome them? Well, the two best ways of doing it is, number one, know the conditions where they're likely to occur. And this is why I'm so concerned about cognitive biases, why I really wanted to make sure it got in the book, is that if you look at, say, something we didn't talk about, which is the bandwagon effect, when would the bandwagon effect show up? Well, when you're making a group decision. When would confirmation bias come up? In research. When would the framing bias come up? Well, in narrative-based numbers. When would the anchoring bias come up? Negotiations. When would the small number bias show up? Well, when you're given statistics about a group or a sample size. On and on and on. And then, so the benefit of knowing the cognitive biases, the most prevalent ones at least, not a whole 167 of them. And by the way, that whole 167 has a lot of overlap in it. The ones that occur most frequently, the ones that I mentioned and the ones that are in the book, are going to occur so often that if you are able to at least understand them and see when they're most likely to occur, those are the times when you can say, I ordinarily would just come up with this, but let me stop. Let me stop when I'm doing this research and ask myself, am I merely looking for the information that I want to confirm my theory, and so forth. So you look for the conditions under which those cognitive biases occur. And number two, and this is really important, is check your emotions. Part of dealing with cognitive biases is recognizing your own weakness in responding emotionally. Many of the cognitive biases operate because emotions are at play. And when emotions are at play, you will jump rational steps like there's no tomorrow. So the two things that you would do is, number one, recognize when are these cognitive biases going to show up? And number two, check your emotions, because they're the things that are most likely to cause your cognitive biases to rise up and bite you. And so those are the points I wanted to make in this, to go into exhaustive depth. I mean, we could go all night long on different cognitive biases, and I went pretty quickly through these, but this is a survey, give you an idea of what cognitive biases are, a couple of suggestions on how to avoid them, and an understanding of how our shortcuts lead to these cognitive biases. And there are times when we can stop them when we know what we're doing up front. With that, Randy, I'm ready for your team if they have any questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was a very enlightening and a little bit sobering discussion, because I can see myself falling for a lot of these things. So we have time now for Q&A. So I'd invite anyone to come forward with questions for Mark, or anyone on Zoom. I know there are some people on the Zoom. Who wants to speak up? Don't be shy. Well,
I drove about 4 hours today to get here, Fresno area up here to Sacramento, and when I left Hanford, it was last week, the gas prices were $3.87. And while I was driving, I saw a lot of the middle, well, actually high end of the $4. And then when I got here to Sacramento, I saw some in the $5 range. And I just wondered whether that's just classic anchor bias, because I literally was thinking I was missing the dollars and seeing the cents. That's not, I was going, oh, that's a pretty good price, but no, it's actually was $1 more than what but anyway, that was one that I thought sounded like a classic anchor. And it's happened to me before when you get these real quick 50 to 75%, 50 to 75 cent increases. That's an anchor, right?
Well, I don't know that it's an anchor because you're not making a decision based on it.
Yes.
So what you're looking at is a price that's good or bad, or, it's whatever it is. It's not a thing that you can really choose. If you're going to the gas station, I guess you could say, I'd rather go to another gas station. Where you might find an anchor in gas prices is you typically will have at least 2, sometimes 3 different prices, on 3 different grades.
Correct.
The question is whether the grades are meaningful. And if you see a real high price, it makes the middle grade look much more attractive. And so in that respect, the anchor can be that tall price. And then you slip into the second grade when actually you could only need to get the lower grade. So it's not pure anchoring in the sense that when you see the price as it is, that there's some anchor involved. But when you're starting to make selections within a particular environment, like on one gas pump or one gas station, you could have that. And sometimes the other factor there is how relevant is the difference in the octane. So, that's kind of a quick way of saying that just seeing the numbers alone isn't an anchor. The anchor is something that's going to make you respond to that number in a way that you wouldn't respond to it if it weren't there.
Yeah, the other place I saw in the last week or so, 2 weeks, was that plane that landed upside down yesterday, the Delta plane, and then all the other accidents that took place in a very short amount of time that were airplane related, and the way the media portrayed it as all of a sudden we've got this huge increase in the percentage of planes that are crashing, and therefore it's really bad. And of course, knowing that it's a very safe way to travel, percentage wise. Yes. And so I guess that's a bias that was right there all over the media for the last 2 weeks.
Absolutely. That's a very classic case of the availability shortcut.
Yeah.
So those come readily to mind. And when there's a combination of things at play there that we didn't talk about, but one of the things that occurs in cognitive bias is that you also have, when you have this availability shortcut, we tend to make stories up of these things. And so there's a coherence bias. And when we make up stories, there's 1 crash, there's 2 crashes, there's 3 crashes. Well, you start making up a story about, there's, it's really dangerous out there. And the only thing that's coming to mind is the crashes that you saw, the few that you saw. And you rightfully recognize that, hey, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to be killed in a commercial aircraft. But when people look at these things and then you get the news media generating a narrative or a coherent story, which becomes more and more believable the more often you hear it, which is another cognitive bias that we didn't talk about, then you're deep into that availability shortcut bias, and you will go astray. And that's how the news media make their money and how we make our mistakes. So you're absolutely right. You picked that one right on.
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. I got something just related to what we were just talking about was, I was thinking the same thing about the airplane crashes. And then I was thinking, well, is there a limit where, okay, let's say there's another airplane crash tomorrow, and then another one the next day, and then another one the next day. Where do you draw the line where now it's a bias versus it's not a bias?
Where you compare it against a baseline. So the step that's missing, remember we're talking about instead of a rational analysis, and a rational analysis here would be a statistical analysis. So statistics means you throw all the data together and then you analyze the data according to a particular schema. So in the case of, I see one crash today and another one. And so I see 15 crashes, which would be absolutely crazy. And, 15 crashes in 15 days, right? That would be unheard of in commercial airlines. And you would be saying, now it really is dangerous. Well, is it? How would you know?
Yeah.
How would you confirm or infirm your initial belief that aircraft flight is dangerous? You compare it against the broader statistics, and that's the leap that isn't made. So what you'll hear, I don't know that anybody in the news media is saying, well, statistically, you're more likely to get hit by lightning than die in a commercial airline crash. I don't know if you'll ever hear that, because that would sort of detune the effectiveness of their use of the availability shortcut. So your question was, at what point does it become not an availability shortcut? Well, it's going to always be one unless you have a full sample size and you've compared the number that you've seen with the actual numbers that are out there. So it's still an availability bias until you've looked at the full span and compared that against the real numbers. And you would see, even in the 15 crashes in 15 days, it still would not be statistically more dangerous to be in an aircraft today than it was 15 days ago.
Right. But if it went up and it kept going for years, then at some point the numbers actually would say that there was a statistical, it's not good to ride an airplane if it was crashing every day for several years in a row, right? I mean,
yes. And actually what you're talking about is exactly how we got to the statistics we have now. So if you go back to the 50s and start in the 50s, there were a whole lot of people that got killed in commercial airlines. And so it really wasn't all that safe. And it became safer and safer because they started looking at how the crashes were occurring, and they constantly made changes to the point where those changes now over the years, technologically and procedurally, as well as in terms of the training, are so much better now that the statistics bias towards safety, not towards danger. Whereas 50 years ago, it was a bias towards danger. And the stories were not an availability shortcut. They were actually representative of the number of crashes. So the total number of flights and the total number of crashes, I mean, when it's happening all the time, you're going to be able to see those numbers show up in the statistics much more easily. And that proportion is going to be bigger. So it's easier to see that as a real threat as opposed to today, where you'd have to have, I don't know how many hundreds of crashes you'd have to really get that number to be significant.
Yeah. It reminds me of I had a boss once that I work in the engineering field, and one thing that he had a phrase that he called the salt shaker effect. What he meant by, I don't know if that's something he came up with or if that's a common term, but had to do with, if you take a salt shaker and shake it on the table, basically the salt is going to be distributed randomly, but you'll see clumps of salt in certain places because it's random. If it wasn't random, if it was completely uniform, it wouldn't be random anymore. It'd be uniform. So when you see these clumps of things, like, oh, you have a week or two of some crashes or whatever, maybe that's kind of part of things being random, that, at some point you're going to get that happening. And when does it happen? Well, sometimes they happen close to each other and sometimes they're far apart.
Yes, that's exactly the situation you have with randomness. Is you're going to find, if you have enough events, that there's going to be some kind of cluster.
Yeah.
And so the clustering illusion is the cognitive bias that people see clusters that aren't really there. But you will have streaks, and that's one of the things that happens in random generation. Is there will somewhere along the road be that streak that's just statistically going to happen.
Yeah, we get that with doing customer support, where we will get a rash of complaints in a certain area to do with the software or something that we're selling or something like that. And they'll all line up like
one right after another, and then we won't hear about it for 2 years, you know? That's just how it happens, you know? So we call it the salt shaker effect, but anyway.
I think that's exactly right. Thank you.
So, come on.
What percentage?
Stand right over here.
Oh, sorry. What percentage of African nations belong to the UN?
I give up. I really don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
We could Google it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
a
but-
couple of things.
you come up with your own numbers, right?
I was wondering, could you relate what you're teaching about bias with the term discernment in scripture? How do they relate? And then the other thing would be, is there a difference between cognitive bias and philosophical or worldview assumptions? They're kind of unprovable, but they certainly bias the way we understand the world.
So give me your first question.
I was just wondering if the in the way that the term discernment is used, especially in the New Testament, how that would relate to cognitive bias or being free of it. I mean, it seems like it would be encouraging us to be free of bias in the way we handle things.
Yes, so I agree with you there. So if a discerning person, the Bible uses that particular language. Discernment means to actually analyze according to the way that the Lord would have you do it. And, Jesus was the wisest, smartest, most intelligent being ever. Still is, by the way. And so when we look at how he thought and the way he acted, he used an incredible amount of intelligence in everything that he did. And he expects us to do the same thing when he tells us to love the Lord with all of our mind. What does that mean? That means that we are to do everything that we can possibly do in whatever we're doing to use every feature of the mind that he gave us exactly as he designed us. We were designed to use shortcuts, because if you don't use shortcuts, you'll go nuts trying to do everything with long thought, as it were put. You can't constantly go through very rigorous evaluations if you're going to ask yourself whether I'm going to go through this intersection with a green light or not. So those kinds of things you just have really easy solutions to. But does the Lord expect us, when we're analyzing, let's say, a scripture verse, and we have competing impressions or interpretations of that scripture verse, does he expect us to analyze that rigorously, or to just walk in and say, well, I have my position and I'm going to prove it? No, he expects us to be open-minded. There's even verses where the Bible talks about, if you hear it from one person, don't just go with that person saying, see what the other person has to say as well. So there are verses throughout the scripture that tell us how to be discerning, but when they're not explicit, like we're talking about cognitive biases here, knowing what the cognitive biases are is part of discernment. So you're exactly right there. Now, in terms of whether a worldview is a cognitive bias, that I would have to say no, because it's not something where it's not a misstep in your thinking. So everyone is superimposing some kind of worldview on what they're doing, right. But that isn't a cognitive bias. That is an overt bias. So you're framing everything in terms of this worldview and interpreting everything from that worldview. You can't not do that. You have that worldview. So cognitive biases are apply in individual decisions, and the worldview isn't an individual decision. It's this whole suite of propositions that combined will give you the way or the means to interpret the world. Mm. So it's really not essentially a function of cognitive bias.
Okay. I had one interesting comment. I knew a guy that was in the automotive industry years ago, and he said at really big automotive shows, where the entrance was, you'd go into kind of this big lobby area, and they would always put their $200,000 or $300,000 cars in there, and then go to the rest of the show, and they were selling cars for $40,000 that seemed pretty cheap after having seen the ones in the lobby.
Yeah, you're seeing exactly how that plays out. We talked about that earlier, and you're exactly right.
Yeah, I have to say something. I just want to talk about biases within the church. They use information that's out of date. I got into a discussion with my brother, and he was telling me how God created everything from nothing. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says things were created from things unseen. That's, and that's consistent with physics. You don't make things from nothing. I know God could do it if he wanted to, but but we pass on these sayings generation after generation. And when we go out into the scientific engineering communities, they all laugh at you because it's inconsistent with science. And they have to go in and have a broad spectrum understanding of not only scripture, but also of the way God created things.
Well, if you have a competing view, how would you test whether his view or your view is the right view?
I would test it. I mean, I would go in and do research.
Okay, so that's my point, is that I wouldn't take side on either one of those, but if you're going to have a discussion on the interpretation of scripture and its application, then it's good to take a position and then present that position. But when you do, realize you're going to start falling into the possibility of the confirmation bias. Am I only going to talk about the positions or the evidence that supports my position? Or am I going to actually listen to the other person and evaluate that without more strict constrictions than I'm reevaluating my own? In other words, I have to look at what the other person is saying exactly the same way I'm looking at mine, and vice versa.
Oh, yeah, but it's just the fact that things are repeated over and over and over again. In other words, people don't bother reading the Bible, they go read commentaries. And that data information may be 200 years old. It's no longer current, but they don't bother with that. They're biased toward the commentaries.
Okay, well, that was not a cognitive bias. That would be a bias for a personal preference, and whatever that reason would be. They think it's authoritative, or they just like reading it. I don't know, but it wouldn't be. That isn't the function of a cognitive bias of the type that we're talking about here. But you're right. People are going to go walk in with biases.
Yeah, but it's hearsay. They're not testing what they believe. They're just accepting what everybody else says.
Yeah, well, that's
I'm
true.
an engineer, so I approach the Bible from an engineering standpoint.
What does that mean?
That means you try to understand the whole picture. In other words, I just saw in a textbook that we are the children of Satan. Really? Is that what we were created as? God created us to be his children, and we were declared good, but we're lost. So when you declare to the world that you're a child of Satan, what kind of bias do you put in their minds?
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
I mean,
It wouldn't be a cognitive bias. So that we're into something different here. Is how are you going to influence people, and how are people influenced?
right. And this has to do with apologetics. How are you going into the world to do apologetics? Are you going out to rescue the lost, or are you going out to attack them and condemn them?
That's right. Exactly the right question to ask.
Yeah. So.
Thank you.
You had mentioned several times in advertising and so forth that people intentionally use cognitive biases to influence things for their own benefit. I just, having come off the political season, the whole poll things, or say the polls are this way or that way, seem to be a chance for the bandwagon effect, for instance, where you're trying to get people to vote a certain way.
Yeah, it is the polls are an interesting thing. There's a whole lot of research just on polls and what cognitive biases are implicated in them. But you're absolutely right that you will see a bandwagon effect. You can even see there is some evidence that election results can change as a result of the statements of polls, not necessarily the polls themselves.
Mm.
So yeah, you have to be careful of that because it pervades everything. And politics is just rife with that, just polluted with all sorts of cognitive biases that are very, very well used because the people who run political campaigns, for example, know these. They hire people who are specialists in this. They hire experts. You know where you find a lot of the research on cognitive biases? In advertising journals on how to advertise and what things work to advertise what kinds of things to what kind of people, segmented into really interesting tiny little pieces. So the cognitive bias research, it's literally called the heuristic and bias tradition, is well known among the advertisers, and advertisers include propagandists and politicians and anybody who wants to influence you, which is why as Christians, we really need to pay attention to this, because you should be afraid that people who are naive to these things can be easily swayed, and they will be.
And good question. Anyone on Zoom have a question? It's your opportunity. Well, while you're waiting to formulate your question for the Zoom public, let me just ask Mark, what are the most significant biases that you see in the church?
The bandwagon effect, and it's an interesting one because it both serves the church and harms the church. So the bandwagon effect is to adopt a position because the people around you adopt that position and you haven't questioned the positions. In other words, you merely adopt that position because everyone around you is doing it. And what if everyone around you is adopting the wrong position? You know, a lot of churches that have wrong positions. So you walk into a church and they're propagating, let's say, a heresy or something that's incomplete, and you have a bandwagon effect there. But flip that around. Let's say the church is propagating exactly what the Bible says. The bandwagon effect works really well. The problem is you would not want it to be the primary way that you're doing your teaching. It just happens to work out well, that when you're teaching well and everybody buys into it, then it tends to stimulate people who come in to adopt it too. But you don't want that as an apologist. What you want is people to adopt the position because they have thought it through.
Yes.
Not merely because everybody says it.
Yes.
So was that responsive to your question?
Yes. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Another one, by the way, is the confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
People tend to look for what they want to be true,
Mm-hmm.
and not see that that's what they're doing.
Yes.
Yeah, at some point I realized when I was 20 or 30, I'll never know that much again. I've had to change my mind on a few things over the years. And so I was thinking when you were talking, I never try to prove something when I'm talking to somebody. I can offer a preponderance of evidence. But I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. I'm willing to hear other positions. It makes it a lot easier to talk to people if we just have a rational conversation and we compare evidences and go back. In fact, I was doing that last week with a couple of people, but I know I'm not 100% right on everything, and it'd be dishonest to pretend I was. So it's almost like I might be a certain percentage right.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's an interesting way of approaching it.
Yeah.
So that probabilistic way of operating in intellectual humility is something that I talk about in the last chapter of the book. So we really don't know a lot of anything. So in terms of absolute knowledge, the only thing we absolutely know is that we exist, that we have, and we are conscious of our perceptions. The rest of it is some kind of probability. Some of them are very high probabilities, really high probabilities. And in other cases, like you said in your statement about there's a whole bunch of stuff that you knew when you were 20 that you don't know now, or however you phrase that, is that when we approach things as being willing to recognize that our knowledge may be probable. I'm 85% sure this is true, but I'm willing to hear maybe that 15% that I don't know about. Maybe it'll change my mind. Maybe not everything, but maybe it'll change the proportion. What preponderance do I want to see in there? So thank you for that admonition to think with a kind of intellectual humility about being probable, not necessarily dogmatic.
And sir, I would just like to know, are you 10% right or 40% right?
85%.
Yeah, depends on the subject. I had a friend that was an expert on marriage because he'd been married 6 times.
Oh, well, that's great. Or
Okay, so-
maybe an expert on divorce.
Yeah. Oh dear. It's like another question. I've heard a lot of people use the term common sense, and they'll use it in arguments a lot where they'll say, well, common sense says, or, well, that's just common sense. And I'm just wondering, how does that fit in with all this cognitive bias stuff? Is there, I don't know, I'm just not sure what to make of it when people talk about common sense. I'm not sure what that even means.
Yeah, and you shouldn't, because common sense is often a vague label to avoid describing what really is there, or that the person is not capable of articulating their position. So I would do exactly what you're thinking, it seems like, is ask them, what exactly do you mean by common sense?
Yeah, I hear it a lot on radio, TV, and stuff like that. So I can't ask them, but yeah, I just wonder sometimes about what that means. But yeah, so basically, it doesn't mean much, is what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm saying. In informal conversation, if two people know each other really well, maybe they understand that term among, between each other.
Sure.
Anywhere beyond that, I'm challenging it.
Okay. Thanks.
Mark, I've heard it said that maybe 40 to 50% of the scientific literature is not verifiable. And unfortunately, that's same in medicine, is what I understand. I assume that a lot of that is due to biases of the researchers, or maybe they're influenced by who's paying them to do the research. Can you comment on that, or are you aware of any statistics like that in the scientific field?
Yeah, so that general sweeping statement that 45 or so percent, or what were the numbers, 45, 50%, something like that?
40, 50, but I may be somewhat off on that, but
That's okay. Any way you look at it, that in that range, that would be way off, at least in certain kinds of disciplines. Where you really will find this as a problem is in, for example, psychology, because it's very, very difficult to replicate the experiments. And so the ability to replicate an experiment is one of the hallmarks of certain kinds of scientific disciplines. So if I'm a material scientist and I want to determine whether a particular material is characterized a certain way, I can conduct an experiment. You know what the instrumentation is, you know what the factors are and what the controls are, and somebody else with the same instruments under the same conditions could replicate it and say, yeah, those are good results. So the replication problem is very pronounced in psychology. And there was one famous study where they looked at, I think, 50 or more psychological studies and couldn't, even in principle, replicate them. And then when they tried to replicate them in practice, they came up with completely different results. And so the psychological literature, for example, requires a lot more scrutiny than, say, physics. Now, if you're looking at, say, physics experimentation that's not for a particular cause, in other words, if you look for physics experiments that are being paid for by an organization that's pro climate change or whatever, some kind of political back thing, then you should be suspicious. And I don't know what the ratio would be, but I know that the ratio in studies for drugs, where the the people who did the research were funded by the drug company, is very high. I don't know what the proportion is that they do. Like, I don't want to quote it, but it would be like 80% come out with the results that the drug company want. And so those are the ones where you really have to look at the statistics. Those are the ones and look at the methodologies, which most people don't. But when you're looking at hard sciences where the replicability is very easy, the reliability of those tends to be very high. What I would estimate, probably depending on the discipline, for example, disciplines where there's a high degree of rigor in the instrumentation and the well researched and well accepted practices, how they go about the experimental methods, would probably be over 90%, because if they can replicate it and others have and they get the same results, that's very reliable. And so I wouldn't look at anything other than where you have conflicts of interest, then you really got to pay attention. So in drug trials, for example, conflict of interest are all over the place. Things that are going to report on anything that has to do with a political issue, I'd be really suspicious about that. So when you don't have conflicts of interest, or it isn't psychology because they're so difficult to replicate them, then the rest of the time I would look at them as being generally reliable, much, much higher than 90%.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Do you have time for another question?
We had a term for that. It's called wine cooler science, which means they make up the science at the end of the day when they're drinking their wine cooler.
I don't know if you heard that. Wine
Yeah, I
cooler.
did. Yeah, that's a good way of doing science backwards.
It's a shortcut for your mind. You don't have to work too hard. That's ultimate laziness, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So just got me thinking here. One of the things I've been concerned about is where I get my news from and how I judge whether the news that I'm watching or listening to am I hearing just one side of the story and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any suggestions for someone who wants to get the news and they want to get the truth? I mean, I'm not sure how to put it, but I really want to know what's going on, but I also don't want to just get one side of the story and such. And I've thought about, you go to this, maybe go to a liberal news agency and then go to a conservative one and compare them or something. I don't know. Do you have any suggestions for how to go about doing that, I guess?
No, but I have no financial interest in ground news, the business called ground news. It's an example of one of the ways of trying to do that. And ground news will give you an estimate of whether the news from this particular outlet is left-leaning or right-leaning, and it'll show you a little bar that shows how far right and far left they are. And so you'll get a feed of however many they show you on a particular subject. And then you can pick and choose if there's anything in there that looks like it's in the middle. Now, I don't know whether that's trustworthy. I can say that I've looked at it. I had a subscription to it for a while. I didn't keep it up because I don't much care about the news. And I'm sorry to shock people that you would think I would think that, but I don't. And part of the reason is remember that the news is entirely selected by the people who want to sell you something.
Right.
So if the kind of news that I care about is the bridge down the street from my house crashed, did somebody blow it up? Or is there something significant where everybody's reporting on it? And then recognizing that almost all the reporting will be wrong at first because the information they're getting is wrong and they want to distort it. So I hold a very low view of journalists, partly because I've seen them in action, partly because I've had them confess to me how they operate, and partly because I've seen them operate. and partly because I watch them use cognitive bias all the time to influence people to believe things that the journalists want you to believe, or their bosses or their editors. So that's a long answer to, I don't know how you're going to get news that's really reliable. And the way, if I really want to get news that's reliable, I will tend to wait and see how things play out. And I like to look at, for example, there are YouTube videos that are published rather quickly after events by people like engineers, like if a bridge collapsed, you'll have an engineer commenting on it and they'll explain it to you. Or they will show you something else. So there are experts in different fields who will comment using YouTube. Now, I'm not a YouTube fanboy, but I just happen to use that occasionally when I do hear something, because my wife is crazy about the news and she tells me everything there is to know.
That's how you get your news.
That's how I get it, whether I like it or not.
Yeah.
So I look at more longer term news.
Yeah.
Because I like to, the short term news is gone in a day. The news cycle is in
I
minutes.
agree. Yeah.
So what do you get out of it? And so I would say the longer the term, the more likely you are to get accuracy, the easier it'll be to spot bias. And there's it's a difficult challenge to lie a lot on longer term things, but you still see political magazines.
Yeah.
So, Newsweek or one of these others, they're all political. So you still get pollution there, partisan pollution.
Yeah.
But there you can look at other things as well and find analyses by people who don't have a bias, particularly scientists, although that you're going to find some biased scientists too.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't give you any more than that.
Okay.
That's the best you can do. that journalism is a wasteland, and it's hard to get the truth.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being with us this evening and enlightening us on biases. I think we're all now going to go out and have our antennas up if we didn't before, so to alert ourselves and our own biases, which are probably the most significant that we have to deal with. Is it's one thing to deal with other people's, but certainly deal with our own. So
Sure.
thank you very much. And next month, speaking of truth, we will be having Travis Campbell here, who will be talking about evidences for the resurrection of Christ. Obviously, we want to see what is really true, both from Scripture and from other evidences. It's been argued that this is one, if not the most detestable event in human history, but what is the evidence? And hopefully we'll be able to explore that and do that in an unbiased way. And now that Mark's enlightened on us so invite you all back next month. We'll do that.